Good evening all, and welcome. This video has been graciously sponsored by Hunter Killer. Hunter Killer is an engaging and addictive subscription box service where you get to be a detective. There's been a murder and it's up to you and your team to solve it. This involves sifting through piles of documents, evidence, audio recordings and case files, eliminating suspects as you go along until you crack the case and catch the killer. It's a fully immersive experience with a very high attention to detail that makes it all the more fun, and so that it feels real. It's definitely the kind of game that you can play with your partner, friends, or family. My wife and I received our box last week and we were absolutely addicted to trying to solve the mystery. We stayed up late 3 nights in a row, and I can honestly say this was the most fun we've had during quarantine and have already signed up for more. We are itching to receive the next part of the mystery, and I'm sure that once you've played, you will be too. So follow the link in the description and punch in the code Mortis to get a discount on your first box. You won't regret it. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My older brother, 4 years old at the time, had just started preschool, and my younger brother had just been born, so I was left without a playmate while my parents were focused on the new baby in the house. Like many kids at that age, I created an imaginary friend to entertain myself. At least this was my parents' rationale. Over the next few months, my imaginary friend and I had become very close. We did nearly everything together. He would push me on the swings, I pulled out my chair for him at every meal, and we would sit in my bedroom and talk for hours. My parents couldn't believe how content I was to spend my days with my imaginary friend. My parents realized my friend was becoming a regular fixture in our lives, and they began to ask me questions about him, and I answered everything I could. "What's your friend's name?" "His name is Uncle Louie." "Where is Uncle Louie from?" "Pennsylvania." "Is Uncle Louie always around?" "Yes, he follows me everywhere I go, except when he goes fishing." My parents were a little shocked when they heard the responses. My father had an uncle named Louie, who lived out on the lake in Pennsylvania, but he had passed away 10 years before I was born. My parents explained that it all felt strange, but they thought perhaps I'd heard a conversation when he was mentioned and held on to a few of the major details. Not too much time passed before I made a comment to my mum that caused her to freeze with fear. "Uncle Louie says he likes your necklace, Mummy." My mother was always wearing a pearl necklace that Uncle Louie gave to her when she married my father 15 years earlier. There's no way I could have known, and she found this very unsettling, but convinced herself it must have been just a random comment from a 3-year-old. Nearly a year had passed, and I was preparing to enter preschool when my parents noticed that I hadn't mentioned Uncle Louie. I expressed no concern to them about him, but their curiosity got the best of them. One night they asked me what happened to Uncle Louie, and I told them that he drowned. Quite morbid for a 3-year-old, but I, like all other 3-year-olds, did not understand death. My mum was spooked by my comment. My dad was terrified. His Uncle Louie suffered a pulmonary embolism. A blood vessel in his lung was clogged and burst, and he drowned in his own blood. I do not remember these experiences, and only in high school did my parents tell me these stories. My older brother also recalls me playing with Uncle Louie. At the time we shared a bedroom, and he said I would always make sure to close our door at night so Uncle Louie could get some sleep and open it in the morning for breakfast. My daughter is 3 years old, and we are already seeing that she has intuition. She has said the time correctly down to the minute, and has known when people have gifts for her, who's at the door without anyone seeing or saying anything, and this really freaked me out. I grew up in a haunted house, and had an imaginary friend that I now assume is the ghost that haunted my childhood home. My grandparents still live there, and my daughter and myself went over to visit yesterday. Everything was going normal until she looked up the stairs. She was staring at a corner and started waving and smiling. I asked her what she was seeing, and she said the name Sarah. I have never mentioned this around her or her mother, so there's no way she would have known about Sarah. I asked what Sarah looked like, and she explained perfectly what I remember. 8-year-old girl, blonde hair, green eyes, black dress. I've been freaking out for over 24 hours about this, and I don't know if we can go back there and I can try and smudge the house. I was around 3 or 4 when I met Sarah. I was a lonely kid. I didn't have any friends, just me and my dog. The house I grew up in was behind my grandparents, and the only time I ever saw Sarah was in their house. She was a mischievous little kid and would play pranks on people, move their stuff and open cabinets, etc. When my cousins would come over, she would get really angry. I remember we would be playing and Sarah would be standing in the same corner just staring at me. She was a lot meaner to my cousins, and she would scare them when I went to sleep. I would always have to apologize to get her to play with me again. After I moved, when I would come visit, I never saw her again, but I would hear her footsteps upstairs and see things moving. The other ghost was one that everyone knew about. It was a 6 or 7 foot shadow with red eyes. Myself, my brother, and my cousins have all seen it. It moves hunched over like a humpback. When you see it, you know it's stalking. We would wake up and it would be standing over us, and we would have scratches all around our body. It would run and hide in one of the rooms that we never went in. The room had 8 porcelain dolls, and they would be rearranged. This ghost, for sure, is still in the house, because I moved back in when I was 20, and it would still mess with me. How did my daughter know the name of my imaginary friend? Unless, of course, she's a bit more than imaginary, and could see her too. When I was a kid from ages 3 to 5, I had an imaginary friend called Tom, who was older than me by a few years. I was the only one of my siblings to ever have an imaginary friend. Something that was strange about Tom was that he was always dying and then coming back to life in strange ways. One time from eating peanut butter when he was allergic. Another was when he jumped on someone's trampoline. Maybe I was just obsessed with soap opera storylines as a child, but this is what I've always thought. I recently found out that before having my older sister and then my brother and I, my mum had a miscarriage. I use the term miscarriage lightly because she didn't even know she had been pregnant until having a heavier than normal period, and when she went in for more fertility checks, they let her know she'd miscarried. Coincidence, right? I'm not 100% sure, and I was often adamant that he was not in fact imaginary, but just the fact that I was a kid and kids do weird stuff. I always maintained that he told me everything about him, even down to his name. This comes in because Tom was the name my mother always wanted to call her son if she ever did have one, although my brother's name isn't Tom. And Tom always perished very suddenly and took maybe a few weeks for him to come back, so to speak. The more I think about it, I've always been super intrigued by the idea of ghosts. Way more than any other of my siblings or anyone in the whole extended family, and have often had a feeling that I wasn't alone when I was the only person in the house. Maybe this interest/predisposition came from being friends with a ghost as a child. And could that ghost/imaginary friend have been my miscarried older sibling? I worked at a summer camp with young children. The camp is divided into 2 age groups, and I work with the younger group, ranging approximately from ages 6 to 9. Today there was this one 9-year-old girl called Jane, who needed to sit out because she was upset, as this boy was picking on her. She was crying, saying that it was too hard being human. Weird for a kid, but kids say weird stuff all the time. When I, with the help of a few other staff members, managed to calm her down a bit and get her to stop crying, she sat quietly but still seemed antsy, like there was something else she needed to get out. After a bit of pressing, my co-worker got her to start talking about her friend Lola. She said that Lola is a ghost and that she met at a different summer camp when she was 3. One of my co-workers asked how she met Lola, and she said that these boys were picking on her, and she heard a voice whisper the words, "Defend yourself," before an invisible force pushed them. Since then, she explained to us that sometimes she hears Lola, just a voice, and sometimes she sees her, either as just a passing shadowy figure or a full person. She said that Lola later gave her advice about bullies, saying to use her words first, but if they hurt her, to hurt them. She then offered to prove Lola's existence. Naturally, I was curious, so she told me that she could get Lola to raise my arms. I agreed to it, and she had me stand up and close my eyes. She then did this weird thing and had me say a chant, causing me to feel my hands, holding my wrists and guide them upwards. She then told me to open my eyes whenever I wanted it to stop. I kept them closed for a bit, but then she told Lola to stop, and I felt hands letting go of me. She later told me that sometimes Lola goes too far. She said that sometimes when she asks her to stop doing things, she's stubborn and reluctant to agree. She told me that Lola follows her around to protect her and took a while to reveal her name. Jane said that she asked Lola why she was following her, and Lola said it was to protect her. She says she asked why, and Lola replied that it was because she's such a nice girl. I took her into the office to have a breather for a different reason, and she asked me if she could draw. I said yes, and she drew 3 pictures. The first 2 were normal, a cat and a jack-o'-lantern. The third was of a little girl with what looked like cat ears and a tail. I assumed that one was normal too, until she told me it was Lola. She told me that Lola was 12 years old and part wolf. This made me assume that Lola was probably just an imaginary friend, and that the thing she did earlier was some psychological trick she learned either online or from some kid on the playground. When we were walking back, she told me about how Lola once held her snake up in mid-air. She couldn't see Lola, just her pet snake levitating. And when she called out to Lola telling her to put him down, she took a moment but eventually did as she was told. While I'm not a skeptic, kids often do have very wild imaginations, so I kind of feel like Lola's an imaginary friend conjured to help her through being bullied. But I don't know, could there be more to it? Could aspects of Lola be rooted in more than just a child's imagination? Are there any parts of the description of Lola that could be linked to any myths or legends? Let me know what you think. This happened when I was roughly 3 to 4 years old. Me and my family had just moved into a new house after the rent on our old house became too high and my mother couldn't afford to pay it anymore. One day, about a week or so after moving in, as me and my mum were home alone, and my older sister was at school, my mum was in the kitchen making me lunch and doing the laundry when she heard me giggling and talking in my bedroom. She thought nothing of it, because it's fairly normal for kids to talk to themselves while playing with toys. When she brought me my lunch, She found me half laying under my bed, talking. She asked who I was talking to, and I emerged from under the bed and replied, "I'm talking to my friend Rose. Can't you see her? She's under the bed." Now, my mum doesn't believe in the paranormal or anything, but this gave her the creeps, and she made me eat my lunch in the living room and told me to watch cartoons so she could keep an eye on me. Fast forward a few days, and my mum has a neighbor over for coffee, and I'm sitting on the floor playing with my toys. Somehow, the topic of Rose came up, and my mum was telling the neighbor about it, and the neighbor starts asking me questions about Rose, like what she looked like, what we spoke about, and so I answered. "She's older than me. She's a teenager. She's got ginger hair and green eyes. She tells me about her mummy. Her mummy was bad." My mum will never forget the look on the neighbor's face. The neighbor then asked to talk with my mum privately, and it wasn't until recently that I found out what the neighbor had told her. It turned out that Rose wasn't just an imaginary friend. She was the ghost of a girl who had previously lived in the house. From what I've been told, Rose was a 16-year-old girl who lived in the house with her mum about 10 years before we moved in. Her mum was an abusive alcoholic, and from what I've heard, that's why Rosemary chose to end her life at the play park across the street. She was sick of her abusive mother and overdosed on painkillers right across from the house. It still saddens me to think of her, because as someone who's been close to doing the same thing, as someone who's dealt with various forms of abuse, I feel her pain, and I just wish she had the support I had when I was in that dark place. When my little sister was between the ages of 2 to 6, this was a long time ago, mind you, as she's 27 now, she had 2 imaginary friends, Madden and Jacob. She was 2 when she started talking about them in serious detail. Every girl in my family starts talking at a very young age, her younger than the rest of us, so believe me, she was detailed. She told us their hair colour, their skin colour, and what they liked to wear. Madden had pale skin and long blonde hair, while Jacob had brown skin with black hair and a red baseball cap. We had no idea where she got the name Madden from. It seemed kind of random. Nobody in the house played Madden football, and she stayed home with me and my mum until she began school. She talked about them more than she talked about anyone in the family. She talked to them all the time, until one day she just stopped. She started first grade, made some visible friends, and never mentioned Madden or Jacob again. We just chalked it up to childhood imagination. Well over 20 years later, I have a daughter. She began talking at 1, and by 18 months was speaking like a pro. One day I was watching her jump on the bed. She was 2, and I was standing there, and she looked at me and said, "Mama, go downstairs, we won't fall off." So I said, "Who won't fall? The 5 little monkeys?" And she nonchalantly said, "No, me, Jacob, and Madden." I was floored, but I immediately called my mum and sister to see if they had mentioned Madden or Jacob recently. They both replied saying that they had completely forgotten about them, and were all so weirded out. Even my super analytical engineer dad was like, "Whoa." I asked my daughter where she heard the names Madden and Jacob, and she simply said, "They told me." Everyone I've told this to is like, "Oh, I'm sure one of you mentioned it to them when she was really little and you forgot all about it." But I know we didn't. As I said, we had all forgotten about my sister's imaginary friends. It isn't exactly a common topic of conversation, is it? Until my kid said she was jumping with them. She's only mentioned them twice since then, and it's been months since she did last. I think the story is nuts. What do you think? This happened a few years ago, when my daughter was around 4 or 5. I'll also mention that although I've never seen a ghost, I can always sense a presence, and whether it's good or bad. My daughter started talking about her friend Emily. I just put it down to her imagination, as she's creative and always has been. Emily was mentioned a lot. Then one day I was home alone just having coffee and watching TV, when I heard my daughter's toys going off, and they were all the sort that had to be pressed and pushed to make noise. She's monkey obsessed and had a big pink monkey that made monkey noises when the middle is pressed, but it's difficult to press it right, if that makes sense. This monkey was one of those toys that went off, so I got up and walked to her room, and a couple of her other noisy toys were going off and flashing. The light on her small fish tank was on, even though I knew I'd turned it off. I lived in the UK at the time, and was on top-up electricity and gas, and was a bit freaked out, but not overly due to our old house having some serious hauntings going on. That was more of a malicious feeling, and I didn't really feel that uneasy with this. I then noticed it was time to go pick up my daughter from school, so I switched off the light and left. On the way home, I thought I'd talk to her about Emily, and she started telling me lots of details, like Emily was 18, she has long brown hair, her full name is Emily Rose Ward, and she died when she got sick, and she wears a long nightie. Ward is a fairly common surname, but my great-grandma's surname was Ward, and she passed away shortly after my daughter was born. I knew she had 2 sisters. One of them was called Emily, who passed away of tuberculosis when she was 18. I'm now convinced she was my daughter's imaginary friend during this time. I've never told this story to anyone, as my family are very much, if you can't see it, feel it, or hear it, it doesn't exist, and my husband just mocks me about my belief in the paranormal. But I thought this might be worth sharing with all of you. I had an imaginary friend. Her name was Emily. She had long blonde hair and her face was half gone. She told me her mum passed away when she was very young, and her father got very sad and took his life, and she never told me how she passed, just that her dad did it. One day we were playing outside in my mum's garden, and my mum yells that it's time for dinner. So I go in as usual, but ask if my friend Emily can join as she was a friend, and never told me she wasn't real. So she said yes and that we can share a plate. After eating, we go outside for a walk, and my mum always liked to get to know the people around. Now there weren't many kids in the neighborhood at the time, so I was usually by myself. Well, while my mum was talking, the older woman saw me and said, "It's great to see more kids round here. We haven't seen much since the accident." Well, my mum got to wondering and asked what happened. So the older woman said that there was a little girl who used to live here called Emily. She lived with both her parents until her mother died, and Emily was the sweetest child you could ever meet. She said that she was around my age when she passed. Well, flash forward. She's talking about the mother passing and how the father became an alcoholic and started to get heavily into drugs. I guess no one found out until they passed. That's when I told my mum about Emily, the one I've been hanging out with, and said something along the lines of, "That's the exact same thing my friend told me." And my mum gave me a look and asked what I meant by that. So I told her that Emily told me that her dad had ended her life and then proceeded to end his own. The lady gave us a weird look. That happened to be the day I found out how she passed. Her father beat her with a hammer, and that's why her face looked like that. And after that day, it was the last time I ever thought or saw her until now. I had a dream last night of her, and she was with my little brother. I woke up so fast and ran upstairs, only to find my brother talking to someone on the couch, but no one was even there. Then today is when he started to talk about her to me. I told him everything, and now I don't know what's gonna happen. I had an imaginary friend, and his name was Nobody. He was just a shadow of a normal person, but 5 times the size of me, and it wasn't just me looking at my own shadow. He was someone I'd see and think about, always distinctively opposite of my real shadow. And for as long as I was thinking about him in that imaginary friend phase, he represents thoughts that served as nothing but contrarian to anything I was thinking. Even if there were negative or malicious thoughts, the thoughts I'd have in response, that at the time I perceived as coming from him, were things like, "No, that's stupid and childish. That's the wrong way. You'll have to wait till you're older." Weird stuff like that. Sometimes I imagined him staying in places on the opposite side of my shadow. When I got used to it, and then he'd start moving and walking around me in a circle, tapping my own shadow in the head as he walked by and then coming back or moving closer. It was loopy. Most friends I have, if they even had imaginary friends, say that. It's quite creepy. Being an only child, I made up an imaginary friend called Joyce. She was another little girl that I spoke to, played with, and even went as far as making a birthday party for her. I never physically saw her or even spoke to me. My parents didn't really think much of it and just let me be. The first weird thing that started happening was every day after school, a little girl would always call asking me from different area codes. This was a landline phone, so when you left a voicemail, it would be played on speaker. Sometimes she would be angry, which my mum thought was weird, as when she would answer, the little girl would hang up. My mum started noticing that these calls were from different states, and continued for about 3 months. Second was a string of weird things that happened. The neighbours always used to say they saw a little girl at my window when we were out or I was playing outside. They thought I had a sister, and my mum would hear a lot of noise and footsteps. The scariest thing was when she came home and heard running upstairs and slammed doors. My mum immediately screamed because she thought someone had broken in. The police were called, and no forced entry and nothing was found. We would take pictures and these people would appear. A bride with long black hair appeared walking past my dad on the couch. Another time these ladies came out sitting at the table. I could go on about the weird experiences, but the scariest one was when the little girl, or whatever the hell it was, called again. Since it was late, my dad thought it must have been a work call, and when he picked up it was a little girl crying asking for me. My dad got goosebumps, and he's a skeptic. I asked her what she wanted, and she wanted us to pray for her, and then it hung up. After that we went to church, and the next day a priest came to bless our home. Pretty much everything calmed down after that. Did I bring my childhood imaginary friend to life? Growing up in a very superstitious family, I was exposed to the paranormal fairly young. At the time of this experience, I was between 4 to 6, and I'm now 15. Like most young children, I had imaginary friends. Now, I don't remember much about the friends, so a lot of the details of them are things that I told my mum, and she later repeated back to me. These friends of mine, one was a boy and the other a girl, were dressed, as I know now, like someone from the early to mid 1800s. The way I described them to my mum was the little boy was wearing a white shirt with buttons, brown pants and straps on his shoulders. The little girl was wearing a long white dress, neither wore shoes, and their clothes had holes. Like most kids with imaginary friends, I would talk to them as if they were really there. So at first my mum didn't really put much thought into it. Soon enough though, she began to think that there was more to this situation than she first believed. The first thing to set her off was when I started talking about the little boy's father. No big deal, right? Except for the fact that I was absolutely terrified of the boy's father, as far as someone crying to my mum about him, after an incident with my brother seeing an entity attached to me. My mother called our preacher. She had him bless the house and myself, and after that I completely stopped seeing the children. I now have very little memory of them. I don't even remember what their names were, but my mum does. But she will not say them, for fear of reattachment. My family and I had just moved into a new house. This was right after the housing market went way up in the 2000s. So the house we were moving into was a dump, but it was all we could afford in our school district. You see, it had previously been a crack house. The windows were busted by police, fences taken down by SWAT, needles in the garbage disposal. It was a dump. My mum and stepdad were fixing it up before we finally moved in. My sister's dad would go over after work and paint it, because everything was covered in graffiti. He got home one night and said, "When I got to the house today, I saw a little kid." This was after they had already replaced the windows so nobody could break in. He said that he came into the house and he saw a little kid go from one bedroom into the master. So he went into the master bedroom and no one was there. At first he thought my mum had been there with my sister and had left someone there. When he realized we were not there, he didn't really know what happened. My mum just told him it was fumes and to open up a window and wear a mask. Keep in mind, my stepdad isn't the type of person to believe in ghosts or paranormal things, and he didn't get scared easy, so this wasn't out of character for him. Right after we moved in almost instantly, my sister had an imaginary friend called Whitehead, and this was unusual because she never played pretend. She never played with dolls or anything, and she was more of a computer Game Boy tech kind of person, and still is today. She was always very logical and thought very scientifically, even though she was young at the time. It was just odd, because she'd never had an imaginary friend before. My mum and I were always the more artsy, wacky ones. Generally, when a child invents an imaginary friend, it's because they want someone to play with. But her imaginary friend was super annoying, and he was always bothering her. She would constantly complain about him, Mikey not sharing a toy, or wouldn't play this game, or he touched my juice. He's not following rules or taking turns. Who invents such an unobedient imaginary friend who you can fight with all day? One day my mum was out front talking with our neighbours, and she was telling my mum that before these people before us, there was another family with kids. Then she asked if they ever saw anything weird in the house. She told my mum that they had seen stuff in the house, and that her son, who was a teenager, when he was little had an imaginary friend called Mikey. The kids that lived in our house before us also played with him, and she had seen him before. My sister and I would spend our weekends with our grandparents, and my mum would take the batteries out of all our toys because they would keep going off randomly when no one was in. I remember I had a piggy bank that made a noise when you put money in. One night it wouldn't stop, so I checked to see if it was jammed, but nothing was in it. So I ended up throwing it away because it wouldn't stop going off in the middle of the night. I had never had problems with sleeping before or after that house, but when we lived there, every morning I would wake up contorted in some way. I would wake up shoved in a little space between my bed and dresser in a ball, and I would always be stuck, and my mum would have to help me out in the morning. I would always try to figure out how, but never could. I was in 3rd to 4th grade at the time, and my mum had put guards on the side of my bed, but I would still end up contorted and shoved between the dresser. This never happened when I stayed with my grandparents. My mum worked a night job and would stay home during the day with my sister. One night she came home from work and was washing her hands in the kitchen. From the kitchen you could see into the living room. My mum turned around because she could feel someone watching her, and for a split second she saw a kid standing there. She said he looked around 8 years old, and in a flash he was gone. Not too long after, it was my sister's birthday. After the party, my sister and I went to my grandparents' house. My mum and stepdad were alone. My mum took all the balloons from the party and tied them together and put them in the corner of the living room. So they were watching TV. The air was off because the weather is nice, and all of a sudden, all of the balloon strings came together like someone grabbed them, and they floated down about a foot. Then they went around the corner and really slowly down the hallway. Then once they got to the light in the hallway, the balloons went down and around the light. It went down to the end of the hallway and stopped at my sister's door. My mum and stepdad were watching in horror, not knowing what to do. So my mum shouts out, "Hey Mikey, if you want those balloons, you can have them." Right when she said that, the balloons went into my sister's room. Now, there used to be a Taco Bell by our house. This was before they started remodeling it, so it looked like a mission. My mum, my sister and I were driving past it, and my sister said, "Mikey said that he used to live in a Taco Bell house." We didn't think anything of it. After we'd lived there for a while, my mum decided to look into the history of the property. Before, it had been a cattle ranch. She then learned that before that, right on the property where our house and 3 others were on, there was a children's mission. It was funded by the Catholic Church, and they had orphans. That's when it clicked. One year my sister said, "It's Mikey's birthday, we have to have a cake." So my mum made a cake, and she then marked it with a little dot on the calendar. Then when she changed over the calendar the next year, she marked it with a dot again, just to see. And the following year on the exact same day, my sister says, "It's Mikey's birthday today, he wants a cake." At Christmas time, my mum went out and bought him a Hot Wheel and a little toy horse, and a few days later the horse disappeared. My sister didn't touch it, and I have no idea where it went. A few years later, when we were playing in the backyard, we found it buried in the yard, and we brought it back inside and put it on the coffee table, and that night, it went missing again, and we haven't seen it since. So I was a picky eater, still am, but my stepdad used to make me stay at the table till I ate all my food. I was also stubborn, so I'd sit there till 10 at night when he would finally just let me go to bed. But every night at that table, I would see a shadow walking around the hallway from room to room. I would just think I was seeing things, but it would happen almost every night. That's pretty much everything I remember. My mum, sister and I moved out after my mum and stepdad split up, and I haven't been back there since. My sister's dad still lives there, and she goes out there on weekends. She's in high school now, and she still tells me about the house and how it feels heavy, and how she sees the shadows. I hope that you have found the story somewhat interesting. For the past few months, my 3-year-old daughter has had an imaginary friend named Callie. I would have pretend tea parties where Callie would join us. I would pretend push Callie on the swing in our backyard, and Callie would help us colour. I figured this was absolutely normal behaviour for an only child of her age. When my daughter started preschool this month, the first day we came into class and met the teachers and mingled with the other parents, got a tour and the normal stuff. After the tour, it was time for the kiddos to play on the playground. My daughter was sprinting around full force with another girl having a blast. They ran up to me at one point, and I asked the little girl her name. It was Callie. What do you guys make of this? Because I was super spooked. I get goosebumps just thinking about it now. When I was little, I used to have an imaginary friend named George who lived in my house with me. Of course, my parents shrugged it off because what kind of toddler doesn't have an imaginary friend at some point? One day me and George were playing, and all of a sudden I started choking badly. My parents come rushing into the room freaking out thinking I'm choking on something, but as soon as they walk in I stop. I'm struggling for breath and crying, and I tell them that George was angry and that I would not do something he wanted. I can't remember what it was, but ever since that day, George was no longer a part of my life. Me being 24 now, I don't really scare that easy from paranormal type stuff, but it seems to always happen. Not too long ago, I was watching some ghostly show on TV. No one was home, and out of nowhere, the dustpan literally flew off the dryer in the room on the other side of the house and landed 10 feet away from where I was originally sitting. Now, I've seen stuff throughout my life, and I also deal with sleep paralysis from time to time. But a big part of me wonders if George is still lurking around and is just salty that I don't speak with him anymore. My grandma knows about George, but no one's ever told her about him. What do you guys think? When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend that was a dog. His name was Skippy, and he went with me everywhere. My mum said when she asked me who Skippy was, thinking it was another kid or imaginary friend, and I told her it was my dog. She asked where he came from, and I told her he came with me, and he's always been with me. I still have the stuffed animal that I felt represented him best. He's a little brown dog with a red bow and brown-black eyes. Right now he's in storage since I'm about to move. Sorry, Skippy, and I don't want to lose him. So that doesn't get at all weird, but there's more. There's the others too. One of the earliest people I remember was the dancing lady. I don't remember this entirely, only the story being told. My mother was cooking at the stove, and to the left of the stove we had some steps that lead to the stairs that go upstairs to the second floor. I was between 2 or 3 years old, sitting and watching her cook. She went to the oven, and then I cried out, "Mum, look out!" And she's confused and goes, "Look out for what?" And I reply back, "The dancing lady, can't you see her? She's right behind you." Years later, my friend Molly is staying the night, and we're all being teenage girls playing on the computer and hanging out before we go to bed. At some point in the night, she went downstairs to get a drink or snacks, and I guess she saw the dancing lady. The next morning we wake up, and she starts asking the history of the house, and telling me she saw a lady dancing in the kitchen, and I'm like, "Molly, are you serious?" And I shared the story of when I was a kid. We were both seriously freaked out after that. There was also another younger girl. I never learnt her name or what she did, but I always felt her presence in the house. Like you know when someone walks behind you and you feel their energy. Okay, someone's behind me. I gotta make sure not to step backwards into them. That's how it always felt when she was around. I noticed this when I was around 9 or 10, and always knew she was around up until I was 15 or 16 or maybe a little older. I think there was a man too, an older man, tall, always wearing black. He had such an awful energy to him, always angry. I don't like thinking about him. Late at night there would be knocks on my bedroom door, which I would assume was the house settling, which was up on the second floor. There would be this noise like nails dragging on a wall. It was such an awful sound. My bedroom was parallel with the wall that led to the bathroom, and I wish it was my older brother, but when I heard these noises and knocking it was late at night. My brother at the time was working the 3rd shift, and I was 14 to 15 when this was going on. My last experience is the most vivid too. This was when I was about 2, and I was first able to get up the stairs. I remember the gate was down, the baby gate, as Mum didn't want me falling down the stairs. But I didn't care because I loved those stairs, and I was hearing noises coming from Mum's room, which was the master bedroom, and it was sort of shaped like a square peanut, wide and long. To the left, when you entered, was a smaller square, where there was some storage closets built into the walls. To the right, there was the bed and dresser, and there were the windows that led out to the roof where I liked to sit. So I crawl up the stairs with my dog Daisy to investigate because I'm a baby and I have the balls to get up there. through the doors, and there inside is a group of 9 men playing cards and smoking cigars. I remember their faces and how they looked so vividly. Most wore these derby hats and were dressed like in black and brown suits and vests. Very dapper looking men for sure. And they were laughing and talking and making bets, just having a good old time. I don't remember much after that, and I'd love to think it was my overactive imagination. But it just feels so real. It was so vivid. The smell of cigar smoke, the chatter and laughter, the feel of the stairs on my hands, and my dog whose hair stood on end the whole time. Daisy was a real dog. She was my best friend as a kid, but not Skippy. She was a black lab with the sweetest brown eyes, chunky and shaggy. I loved her so much. I like to think she was sort of being protective, like a second mum for me but a dog. Here's a little background about the house I grew up in. It was built in 1920 to 24, originally had 2 stories and later had some additions built on, like a back porch and the side office room. And the house next door may have been connected to my house on the same property. The house next door was a brothel, and I know this because each bedroom had its own bathroom, and the living room was sort of split off. The front entrance was smaller, and then you went through the double doors into the huge living room. The kitchen was tiny, and it had a little second room just behind it. I loved that house. My dad's friend Terry owned it, and she was such a big influence in my life growing up. We would go to the beach together, and I'd sleep over at her house, and she was like an aunt to me. I haven't heard from her in years, but I'd love to know how she is. Her house was huge and I loved it, and was built just before my house was, and is a historical property in the area. My house also has a marker in front of it. Anyway, there's a rumor that someone ended their life in that house. Not like the people before us, but the ones before that. They said it was the stepmom of the guy who lived there. I never encountered anything like that, but I've hated my childhood house since I'm an adult. Maybe not hate, maybe just really don't want to ever go back there. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I'm gonna be honest, I don't actually know why we don't do imaginary friend stories more often. They're really good. I was quite impressed. The thing is, these kind of stories are generally a bit more rare to find, and so when I categorize them I forget how good they are, and then when I've got a large number that I think, oh maybe I'll read this one today, I forget how good they are. So I was a bit dubious. I was like, okay, well you voted for it so you get it. But yeah, I'm really glad you did. These were some pretty good stories, pretty creepy. So I hope you guys liked them. You know what to do if you did. As always, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my lovely patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you're interested in getting some cool rewards for signing up to Patreon, just check out the link, get your name at the end, and depending on how much you pledge, you get even more. Thanks, guys. Alright then, well I hope that you enjoyed the video. Oh, and seriously, this Hunter Killer promo, the Hunter Killer box is really, really good. It's really fun, and I would definitely recommend it 100% wholeheartedly. If you're thinking about getting it, do. It's so much fun. Alright then guys, well for now it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.